The scream cut through the night before Wren even opened her eyes. She was awake in an instant, heart slamming against her ribs, the thin blanket tangled around her legs as she scrambled up from the cold floor of the shelter. Around her, the other runts were stirring too, their faces pale in the dim light of a single flickering lantern. Nobody asked what was happening. They already knew. The guards were back. Wren pressed herself against the wall as heavy footsteps echoed down the narrow stone corridor outside. 3 shapes passed the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the deep green cloaks that marked them as members of the Royal Guard. She recognized the one in front by his walk alone, Cade, the commander. The wolf every runt in this corner of the palace grounds feared more than hunger or cold. Beside her, a boy named Finn grabbed her arm. He couldn't have been older than 12, and his eyes were wide with the kind of fear that never quite left a person, even when the danger had passed. "They're going for the training yard," he whispered. "Someone missed morning duties again." Wren's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who that someone was. Tessa. Tessa was barely older than Finn, a small, quiet Omega girl who had been assigned kitchen work despite a fever that had kept her bedridden for 3 days. She had tried to explain to the overseer that she was too weak to carry the water buckets, but explanations meant nothing to the guards. Weakness meant nothing to them, except an excuse to remind the runts of their place. Wren didn't think. She was moving before her mind caught up with her feet, slipping out of the shelter and into the shadows between the old stone buildings that made up the runts' quarter of the palace grounds. This part of the territory had been built generations ago, back when the Alpha line had been less concerned with appearances, and it showed. Cracked walls, rotting wood, a place where the pack's outcasts were kept just close enough to be useful and just far enough to be forgotten. She reached the edge of the training yard, in time to see Tessa on her knees in the dirt, guards circling her like she was prey rather than a person. Cade stood at the center, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "You embarrass this pack," Cade said, his voice calm, in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "A runt who cannot perform simple tasks has no purpose here." "Please," Tessa managed, her voice trembling. "I was sick. I could barely stand." "Excuses." Cade crouched down until he was eye level with her. "The Alpha King's guard does not accept excuses. Perhaps a lesson will help you remember your duties next time." Wren's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had seen this before, too many times, and she knew what came next. The guards would not use their claws, not exactly. They were too careful for that, too aware of exactly how much harm they could cause without leaving marks that couldn't be explained away. But calling it discipline didn't make it any less cruel. It didn't make the runts hurt any less, or fear any less, or feel any smaller in a world that already treated them as though they barely mattered. She stepped out from the shadows. "She said she was sick," Wren called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sickness isn't disobedience." Every head in the yard turned toward her. She felt Finn's hand grab for her sleeve from somewhere behind, trying to pull her back into hiding, but she didn't move. Cade rose slowly to his full height, studying her the way a wolf studies something it has decided is beneath its notice. "Another one," he said, almost amused. "Do the runts think they can simply speak whenever they please now?" "I only meant—" "You meant nothing," Cade interrupted. "Return to your quarters before I decide you need a lesson as well." Wren's throat tightened, but she held her ground, glancing toward Tessa, who was still trembling in the dirt. Around them, other runts had begun to gather at the edges of the yard, drawn by the commotion but too afraid to step any closer. She could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of hope and terror, as though they were waiting to see whether tonight would be the night someone finally stood up long enough to make a difference. It wasn't. Wren knew that even as she stood there. She had no strength to back up her words, no rank, no claim to anything beyond the small patch of floor she slept on each night. The guards could do whatever they wanted, and there was nothing she or anyone else in the runts' quarter could do to stop them. But she stayed anyway, because someone had to. Cade took a single step toward her, and Wren braced herself for what was coming. She had learned long ago that bravery in this place rarely went unpunished. It only bought a little time, a small distraction, enough for someone else to slip away while the guard's attention shifted. That was all she wanted tonight, a distraction. Enough time for Tessa to escape into the shadows, while Cade decided what to do with her instead. "Kneel," Cade said quietly. Wren's knees nearly buckled from the command in his voice alone. An alpha-blooded wolf's authority pressing down on her like a physical weight. She fought against it, forcing herself to stay upright even as her whole body trembled with the effort. I said kneel. She didn't. Not because she was strong enough to resist forever, but because in this single moment, refusing felt like the only thing she had left that was truly hers. Cade's eyes narrowed, and Ren understood, with sudden clarity, that she had made a terrible mistake. That was the moment everything changed, though none of them knew it yet. A voice rang out from beyond the training yard, unfamiliar and sharp with authority that had nothing to do with wolf instinct or alpha blood. What in the world is going on here? Every guard in the yard froze. Ren turned, along with everyone else, to see a woman standing at the edge of the torchlight. She was human. That much was obvious even from a distance, in the way she carried herself, the way her scent held none of the sharp, layered notes that marked shifters. She wore travel clothes that looked out of place against the palace's stonework, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, strands escaping from what had clearly been a long day. But it wasn't her human scent that made the guards go rigid with unease. It was the golden mark glowing faintly at the base of her wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, the unmistakable sign of a mate bond, tied directly to the Alpha King himself. "Who is in charge here?" the woman demanded, striding into the yard as though she had every right to be there, which, Ren realized with a jolt, she did. Cade's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head with the barest hint of respect. "This does not concern you. A girl on her knees in the dirt while 3 grown men stand over her certainly concerns me." The woman's eyes swept across the scene, Tessa trembling on the ground, Ren still refusing to kneel, the ring of frightened runts watching from the shadows. Something in her expression shifted, hardened. "Someone explain to me exactly what is happening, and it had better be a very good explanation." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Ren watched the guards exchange uncertain glances, none of them willing to be the one who answered. Finally, Cade straightened his shoulders. "Pack discipline, nothing more." "Pack discipline," the woman repeated flatly. She crossed her arms. "It looked like grown men frightening children to me." "With respect," Cade said, though his tone suggested very little respect at all. "You do not understand our ways. This is how the pack has always—" "I don't care how it's always been." Her voice cut through his sentence like a blade. "I care about what I just watched. Now step back, all of you." Nobody moved. Ren's heart pounded as the standoff stretched on, the tension in the yard thick enough to choke on. She had never seen anyone speak to the royal guard this way. Not the Omegas, not the Betas, not even the pack elders. It was as though this woman didn't understand, or didn't care, that she was supposed to be afraid. Then, slowly, Cade stepped back. Not out of respect, Ren suspected, but out of caution. Whoever this woman was, whatever claim she had on the Alpha King, it was clearly enough to make even the guard commander think twice about defying her openly. "This is not finished," Cade said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, before turning and striding out of the yard. His guards followed, casting wary glances back at the woman as they went. The moment they were gone, the tension in the yard broke all at once. Tessa collapsed fully to the ground, sobbing quietly with relief, and 2 of the other runts rushed forward to help her up. Ren finally allowed her knees to give out, sinking down onto the packed dirt as the adrenaline drained out of her all at once, leaving her shaking and lightheaded. The woman knelt beside her without hesitation, apparently unconcerned about the dirt or the late hour, or the fact that she had just openly challenged the pack's most feared enforcers. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice gentler now, though the sharpness hadn't fully left her eyes. "I'm fine," Ren managed, though her voice shook. "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what? Stop them from hurting a sick child?" The woman shook her head. "I don't understand what I just walked into, but I know what I saw, and I know it was wrong." Ren studied her more closely now that the danger had passed. Up close, the woman looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from more than just a long day. There was something else in her expression too. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief, as though she herself couldn't quite explain how she had ended up standing in this dirt yard in the middle of the night. "You're human," Ren said, though it wasn't really a question. "I am." The woman offered a small, tired smile. "My name is Elena. I only arrived here a few hours ago, and I still don't fully understand what's happening to me, if I'm honest. But I do understand cruelty when I see it. and I wasn't about to walk past and pretend I didn't. Around them, the other runts had begun to creep closer, drawn by curiosity now that the immediate danger had passed. Finn hovered nearby, staring at Elena with wide eyes, and even Tessa, still trembling from her ordeal, watched the human woman with a kind of cautious wonder. "They'll come back," Ren said quietly. "They always come back." Elena's expression darkened, but there was something steady in it too, something that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Then I suppose I'll have to be here when they do." Ren didn't know what to make of that. She had lived her whole life in the shadow of the palace, watching stronger wolves decide the fate of weaker ones without a second thought, and she had never once seen anyone, human or shifter, stand between the runts and the guards' cruelty. It didn't seem possible that one exhausted, unfamiliar woman with no claws and no wolf blood could change anything. And yet, something about the way Elena had spoken to Cade, the way she had refused to back down even as an alpha-blooded commander loomed over her, made Ren wonder if she was wrong. "You don't even know us," Ren said. "Why would you help?" Elena was quiet for a moment, looking around at the gathered runts, thin, tired, marked in small ways by years of neglect and mistreatment. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but certain. "Because nobody else seems to be helping you. And that's not right." It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't a declaration of war against the guards or the pack's oldest traditions. It was just a simple statement, spoken by someone who had no reason to care about a group of forgotten runts in a corner of a world she barely understood. But it was enough to plant something in Ren's chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope. She had learned not to trust hope too easily, but something close to it. A small, fragile possibility that things might not always be exactly as they had always been. She didn't know yet how much that possibility would cost, or how far it would carry all of them before the end. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at the runts and seen more than weakness. Someone had looked at them and seen people worth protecting. As Elena helped Tessa to her feet and began asking quiet questions about where the runts slept, what they ate, how long this had been going on, Ren found herself watching the human woman with a mixture of caution and something dangerously close to trust. She didn't know Elena's full story yet, didn't know how a human had ended up bonded to the Alpha King, or what that bond even meant for someone with no wolf blood of her own. She only knew that tonight, when it mattered, this stranger had chosen to stand between the powerless and the cruel. That had to count for something. Above them, the palace loomed in the darkness, its towers catching the last light of the moon before clouds swept across the sky. Somewhere within those walls, the Alpha King slept, unaware that the woman fate had chosen as his mate had already begun to see things in his kingdom that he himself had spent years refusing to look at too closely. Ren didn't know it yet, but the guards' cruelty, the runts' suffering, the silence that had let it all continue for so long, all of it was about to be dragged into the light. And nothing in the pack would ever be quite the same again. For now, though, there was only the cold night air, the quiet sobs of relief from Tessa, and the strange, steady presence of a human woman who had walked into a nightmare and refused to look away. It was, Ren thought, as she finally allowed herself to breathe, the first time in years that the training yard had felt like anything other than a place of fear. She held on to that feeling as long as she could, because she suspected that whatever came next, it would not be easy. The guards did not forgive challenges to their authority, and Cade's parting words still echoed in her mind. This is not finished. No, Ren thought, watching Elena gently examine the bruises already forming on Tessa's arms. It certainly wasn't, but for the first time, she found herself almost eager to see what would happen next. Morning came too quickly for Elena's liking. She had barely slept, her mind still turning over everything she had witnessed in the training yard, when a soft knock sounded at the door of the guest chamber she had been given the night before. She sat up, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings, the high stone ceiling, the heavy tapestries, the faint scent of pine drifting in through an open window that overlooked forest she had never seen before yesterday. "Come in," she called, running a hand through her tangled hair. The door opened to reveal a woman, perhaps a few years older than Elena, with warm brown eyes and a calm, measured way of moving that suggested she had spent a long time learning to be unremarkable in a place that rewarded strength above all else. She carried a tray with simple food, bread, fruit, something that smelled like tea, and set it down on the small table near the window. "My name is Mira," the woman said. "I look after the healing house here. I heard what happened last night." Elena straightened. Word travels fast. In a place this small, it always does. Mira's expression was careful, guarded in a way that made Elena wonder how much she was choosing not to say. "I also heard that you're the Alpha King's mate." "So I'm told." Elena glanced down at the golden mark on her wrist, still faintly warm to the touch, still utterly inexplicable. 24 hours ago she had been an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, and now, she was expected to believe she was bonded, by some ancient and unbreakable magic, to a man she had met for exactly 10 minutes the night before. "I still don't fully understand what that means." "It means more than most people here will ever admit to you," Mira said quietly. She hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking that no one else was listening. "It also means, you may be the only person in this palace with enough standing to do something about what you saw last night." Elena's attention sharpened. "You know about the guards, about what they do to the Runts." "Everyone knows," Mira said, and there was a tired bitterness in her voice that told Elena this was not new information, not a single unfortunate incident, but something that had been allowed to continue for a very long time. "I've treated their injuries more times than I can count, bruises that heal too slowly, wounds they're too afraid to explain honestly, children who flinch when a door closes too loudly. Then why hasn't anyone stopped it?" Mira's laugh held no humor at all. "Because the Runts have no rank, no strength, and no one willing to risk their own position to defend them. The guards answer only to the king, and the king has never looked closely enough to see what happens in that corner of his own territory." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And Cade, the commander?" "Cade has led the royal guard for nearly a decade," Mira said. "He built his reputation on the idea that weakness threatens the pack's survival. Most of the older wolves agree with him, even if they'd never admit to enjoying what happens because of it. It's called tradition, discipline, a way of keeping the pack strong." "It's cruelty," Elena said flatly, dressed up in nicer words. "Yes," Mira agreed simply. "It is." They sat with that admission for a moment, the morning light shifting slowly across the stone floor. Elena thought of Ren's steady refusal to kneel, of Tessa's trembling shoulders, of the ring of frightened faces watching from the shadows, as though they had long ago stopped expecting anyone to help them. She thought of the golden mark on her wrist, and the strange, unwanted weight of what it apparently meant. "I need to speak to Dorian," she said finally. Mira's eyebrows rose slightly at the use of the Alpha King's given name, but she said nothing about it. "He holds council in an hour. I can show you the way, if you'd like." Elena nodded, already reaching for the plain travel clothes she'd worn the day before, the only clothing she currently owned in this entire strange new world. "I'd like that very much." The council chamber, when they reached it, was nothing like Elena had expected. She had pictured something grand and imposing, full of banners and thrones, but instead found a simple round room, with a long wooden table, worn smooth by generations of use, surrounded by a handful of pack elders and advisors, already deep in quiet discussion. At the head of the table sat Dorian Ashgrave, Alpha King of a territory Elena still couldn't fully picture on a map, looking exactly as unsettled by her arrival the night before, as she felt about all of this now. He was younger than she had expected an Alpha King to be, though there was an unmistakable weight to the way he carried himself, a burden that seemed to sit permanently across his shoulders. When his eyes met hers across the room, something in his expression shifted, not quite warmth, not yet, but a kind of wary recognition, as though some part of him understood, even without wanting to, that the bond between them was not something either of them could simply ignore. "Elena." He rose from his seat, and the murmur of conversation around the table died instantly. "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "I imagine not," she said, stepping fully into the room, despite the curious, assessing stares of the elders around the table. "But something happened last night that I think you need to hear about directly." Dorian's expression grew guarded. "Go on." Elena told him everything, the training yard, Tessa on her knees in the dirt, Ren's refusal to back down even as Cade's authority pressed down on her, the ring of frightened Runts watching from the shadows, as though violence in their direction was simply an ordinary part of life. She spoke plainly, without exaggeration, because the truth alone was damning enough. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched long and uncomfortable. Several of the elders exchanged glances that Elena couldn't quite read, though none of them looked particularly surprised by what she had described. "This is a pack matter," one of the older wolves said carefully, an aged man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had clearly seen many decades pass. "The training of the guard, the discipline of lesser-ranked wolves. These are traditions that predate your arrival, and mine, and likely the king's grandfather's as well." "Traditions can be wrong," Elena said. "They can also be necessary," the elder replied, not unkindly, though there was steel beneath his measured tone. "The runts are weak. Without discipline, without structure, the pack risks losing the strength that has protected this territory for generations." Elena turned to Dorian, searching his face for some sign of agreement or disagreement, but found only careful neutrality, the expression of a man weighing far more than she yet understood. "Do you believe that?" she asked him directly. "That hurting children keeps this pack strong?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I have inherited a great many traditions I have not always had the chance to examine closely. And I believe that what you witnessed last night deserves my attention." It wasn't the full agreement Elena had hoped for, but it was something. She could see, in the careful way he chose his words, that he was navigating currents she didn't yet understand. Old loyalties, old expectations, a council of elders who clearly held more sway over pack customs than she had assumed a king would allow. "Your attention isn't enough," she said. Tessa could barely stand. "She's a child. I understand your concern," Dorian said, and there was something almost pleading in his tone now, an unspoken request for patience she wasn't sure she was willing to grant. "But I cannot simply dismantle generations of pack structure overnight, not without risking far greater instability. Cade commands the loyalty of the guard. Moving against him carelessly could fracture the very forces that protect this territory. So the runts continue to suffer while you weigh your options," Elena said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "I did not say that. You didn't say the opposite either." The elders around the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to seeing anyone speak to their king this way, but Elena found she didn't particularly care. She had walked into a world she didn't understand, bound by a mark on her wrist to a man she had known for less than a day, and the one clear thing she had learned in that short time was that cruelty was being allowed to continue, simply because no one with enough power had bothered to stop it. She wasn't going to be that kind of person, not when she had already seen exactly what silence cost. "I'll find another way then," she said quietly, more to herself than to the room. "If you won't act, I will." Dorian's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing behind them. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to respect, though it was hard to be certain. "Elena, I'm not asking your permission," she said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that the room fell silent again. "I'm telling you what I intend to do. What you choose to do about it is your decision." She turned and left the council chamber without waiting for a response, aware of the weight of every stare following her out, aware too of the strange, uncomfortable knowledge settling in her chest that she had just openly challenged an alpha king in front of his own advisors on her very first morning in this world. She didn't regret it, not for a second. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen over the palace grounds, casting long shadows across the courtyard as pack members went about their daily business, most too busy or too indifferent to notice the human woman making her way purposefully toward the distant, crumbling buildings of the Runts quarter. Mira caught up with her halfway there, falling into step beside her without a word of judgment. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Mira said eventually. "Maybe both," Elena admitted, "but I meant what I said. I'm not going to stand by and pretend I didn't see what I saw." Mira studied her for a long moment, something like cautious approval settling into her expression. "Then you're going to need help. Real help, not just good intentions." "I know." Elena glanced toward the Runts quarter, where she could already see small, thin figures beginning to stir in the morning light, some watching her approach with the same wary hope she had seen in Ren's eyes the night before. "That's exactly why I'm here." Whatever came next, Elena understood one thing with complete certainty. She was not going to walk away from this. Not from the Runts, Not from the golden mark on her wrist that tied her fate to a king still learning what kind of leader he wanted to be, and certainly not from the quiet, unshakable conviction that had settled into her chest the moment she saw Tessa kneeling in the dirt. Somewhere in this palace, a reckoning was coming. Elena intended to make sure of it. The Runts quarter looked even more forgotten in daylight than it had in the shadows of the night before. Elena walked slowly through the narrow paths between the crumbling stone buildings, taking in details she hadn't been able to see clearly the previous evening. Cracked walls patched with scraps of wood, windows without glass, covered instead with old cloth to keep out the wind. A well in the center of the small courtyard that looked as though it hadn't been properly maintained in years. It was such a stark contrast to the grandeur of the main palace that it was hard to believe both places belonged to the same territory, ruled by the same king. Mira walked beside her, offering quiet explanations as they passed. The Runts are usually the offspring of low-ranked wolves, or omegas who couldn't find a place elsewhere in the pack. Some are born weak, others are simply born unlucky, in families with no strength to protect them. And the guards are allowed to do whatever they want to them. Allowed is a strong word, Mira said carefully. Tolerated, perhaps, is more accurate. No one has ever formally given the guards permission to hurt the Runts. But no one has ever stopped them either, and over time, the difference between permission and silence tends to disappear. Elena's jaw tightened as they reached the small courtyard where she had found the Runts gathered the night before. Several of them were already outside, going about quiet morning tasks, carrying water, mending torn clothing, tending to a small garden that looked as though it produced barely enough to feed the number of mouths that depended on it. They looked up as Elena and Mira approached, conversations dying into wary silence. Ren was among them, sitting near the well with a bandage wrapped around one wrist that Elena hadn't noticed the night before. She rose to her feet as Elena drew closer, expression guarded but curious. "You came back," Ren said, sounding faintly surprised. "Of course I did." Elena glanced around at the gathered Runts, taking in their thin frames, their careful, watchful expressions. "I told you I would." "People say a lot of things," Ren replied, not unkindly, just honestly. "Doesn't mean they mean them." Elena couldn't argue with that. She understood, in a way she hadn't quite grasped the night before, just how much these children, because that was what most of them were, children, had learned to expect from the world around them. Broken promises, empty comfort, adults with power, who looked away, rather than getting involved. "I meant it," she said simply. "I want to help, but I need to understand what's actually happening here first. All of it, not just what I saw last night." Ren studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether trust was worth the risk. Finally, she nodded toward a low wooden bench near the well. "You should sit. This might take a while." Over the next hour, Elena listened as Ren, joined gradually by other Runts who grew braver as the conversation continued, described a pattern of mistreatment that ran far deeper than the single incident Elena had witnessed. Guards who assigned impossible tasks and punished failure without mercy. A system where any perceived weakness, illness, exhaustion, simple bad luck, became an excuse for cruelty dressed up as discipline. Children who had learned to hide injuries rather than seek help, because seeking help drew attention, and attention from the guards was rarely a good thing. "How long has this been happening?" Elena asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. "As long as anyone can remember," an older boy named Callum answered. He looked to be in his late teens, with a guarded, careful way of speaking that suggested he had learned early to choose his words wisely. Cade's father led the guard before him, and it was the same then, maybe worse. "And no one has ever tried to stop it?" "Some have tried," Callum said. "None of them lasted long enough to make a difference." Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warm morning sun. "What happened to them?" Callum exchanged a glance with Ren before answering. "One beta tried to report it to the previous king, years ago. He was reassigned to a distant outpost within a month. Officially, it was a promotion. Unofficially, everyone understood it was a warning." "And since Dorian became king?" "Nothing has changed," Ren said quietly. "If anything, it's gotten worse. Cade has more freedom now than he did under the old king. No one questions him." Elena sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what she had stepped into. This wasn't a single instance of cruelty she could simply demand an end to. This was a system, built over generations, protected by silence and fear, and the quiet complicity of everyone who had the power to stop it, and chose not to. But systems, she reminded herself, were built by people, and what people built, people could also take apart. "I want to help," she said again, more firmly this time, "but I'm going to need more than good intentions. I need proof, real evidence of what's been happening. Dates, injuries, witnesses willing to speak. Something undeniable enough that even the most stubborn elder can't dismiss it as tradition." The Runts exchanged uncertain glances. Elena understood their hesitation immediately. Speaking up had never worked out well for anyone in this quarter before, and she was, after all, still a stranger to them, human, and unfamiliar with their world, no matter how genuine her intentions might be. "I know I'm asking a lot," she said, "and I know you have no reason to trust that this will end differently than every other time someone has tried to help. But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I intend to see this through." It was Ren who spoke first, breaking the uncertain silence. "I'll help," she said. "I've kept track of things anyway, in my head, dates, what happened. It's not much, but it's something." One by one, hesitantly, others began to offer similar admissions, small pieces of information. Injuries they remembered, patterns they had noticed over months and years of watching the guards operate with impunity. It wasn't a complete picture yet, not by any means, but it was a beginning, and Elena understood that beginnings mattered. Mira, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "I can add my own records," she offered. "I've treated injuries from this quarter for years. I never documented them as thoroughly as I should have, out of fear of exactly this kind of situation. But I remember enough to be useful." "Thank you," Elena said, meaning it deeply. "All of you." As the morning stretched on, Elena found herself sitting with the Runts, long after the initial conversation had ended, listening to smaller stories, quieter fears, the ordinary details of lives lived in the shadow of constant uncertainty. She learned that Finn, the young boy from the night before, had lost both parents to a territory dispute years ago, and had been raised entirely within this forgotten quarter. She learned that Tessa's fever had finally broken overnight, though she remained too exhausted to leave her bed. She learned that Ren, despite her frail appearance, had a quiet, steady strength that reminded Elena of exactly the kind of person she wanted standing beside her in whatever came next. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward late afternoon, Elena had filled several pages of a borrowed notebook with names, dates, and details, a growing record of exactly the kind of systemic cruelty that could no longer be dismissed as an unfortunate exception. She was gathering her things to leave, already turning over in her mind what her next step should be, when a shadow fell across the courtyard entrance. Cade stood there, flanked by two of his guards, his expression carrying none of the careful restraint he'd shown the night before. Whatever patience he had exercised then had apparently run out. "I heard you've been spending quite a lot of time in this quarter," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "Gathering stories, I understand. Building a case against my guard." Elena straightened, meeting his gaze directly, despite the sudden tension that rippled through the Runts around her. "I'm gathering the truth. There's a difference." "Careful," Cade said, taking a slow step forward. "You may hold the king's mark, but that mark does not grant you authority over pack matters that have existed since long before you arrived. I would advise you to remember your place." "And I would advise you," Elena replied evenly, refusing to let the threat in his voice unsettle her, "to remember that hurting children is wrong, regardless of what tradition you dress it up in." For a long moment, Cade said nothing, simply studying her with an expression that gave nothing away. Then, slowly, he smiled, an expression that held no warmth at all. "We'll see how long your conviction lasts," he said quietly, before turning and striding away, his guards falling into step behind him. The tension in the courtyard didn't break until he was fully out of sight. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, aware of the Runts around her watching with a mixture of fear and something that looked almost like awe. "He won't forget this," Callum said quietly. "You've made yourself his enemy now." "Good," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. "It's about time someone did." Word of Elena's confrontation with Cade traveled through the palace faster than she expected. By the time she returned to her chamber that evening, exhausted and still turning over everything she had learned that day, a servant informed her that Dorian wished to see her privately before supper. She almost declined, still frustrated by his careful neutrality in the council chamber that morning. But curiosity won out over irritation, and she followed the servant through the winding stone corridors to a smaller, more private room she hadn't yet seen. Dorian was waiting alone when she arrived, standing near a tall window that looked out over the darkening forest beyond the palace walls. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the mate bond settling uncomfortably in the silence between them. "I heard about your visit to the Runts quarter," he said finally, "and your conversation with Cade." "Word travels fast in this place," Elena said, echoing her own thought from earlier that day. "It does." Dorian gestured toward a pair of chairs near the window, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena took the offered seat, watching him carefully as he settled into the other. "I want you to understand something, Elena. What you're asking me to do isn't as simple as it may appear from the outside." "I'm not asking you to do anything complicated," she said. "I'm asking you to stop allowing children to be hurt." "And I agree that it should stop," Dorian said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice for the first time since she'd met him. "But you don't understand the position I'm in. Cade commands the loyalty of nearly every guard in this palace. His father served my father, and his father before that. Moving against him without careful preparation risks fracturing the very forces that keep this territory safe from outside threats. So instead, you let him keep hurting Runts." "I did not say that," Dorian said, an edge of genuine frustration entering his voice now. "I am telling you that ruling a pack requires balancing many pressures at once, pressures you have had exactly 1 day to begin understanding. I did not ask for this bond any more than you did, Elena, but I am trying to take it seriously. That means I cannot simply act on impulse, however righteous that impulse might be." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for some sign of the cold indifference she had half expected to find, and finding instead something closer to genuine conflict. He wasn't defending Cade's cruelty. Not exactly. He was defending caution, and though she understood the impulse, she found she had very little patience left for it. "How long have you known what happens in that quarter?" she asked quietly. Dorian's jaw tightened. "Rumors, mostly. Nothing I could ever fully confirm." "You never asked." He stopped, something shifting behind his eyes, an admission he seemed reluctant to voice aloud. "No. I never asked directly. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in matters my father's advisors assured me were simply tradition." "That's exactly the problem," Elena said, leaning forward. "Tradition isn't an excuse for cruelty, Dorian. It's just a word people use to avoid taking responsibility for things they'd rather not examine too closely." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them had fully said yet. Elena watched something flicker across Dorian's expression. Not quite agreement, but something close to it, a crack in the careful composure he had maintained since she arrived. "I brought you evidence," she said finally, pulling the borrowed notebook from her bag and setting it on the table between them. "Dates, names, injuries the healer has treated for years without ever being able to speak openly about their cause. It isn't complete yet, but it's a beginning, and I think if you actually look at it, actually see the pattern laid out in front of you, instead of hearing it secondhand through rumors you've chosen to ignore, you won't be able to keep calling this tradition." Dorian reached for the notebook slowly, as though it weighed far more than its actual size suggested. He opened it, and Elena watched his expression shift as he read, page by page, the careful record of years of quiet suffering that had been allowed to continue unchecked in his own territory. "This is—" He trailed off, something raw entering his voice. "This is far worse than I allowed myself to believe." "It's real," Elena said quietly. "It's been real the entire time. You just never looked closely enough to see it." Dorian closed the notebook slowly, his expression heavier now than it had been when she arrived. "I need to think carefully about how to address this. If I move against Cade, without sufficient support, without enough of the pack's elders standing behind me, I risk—" "You risk making a difficult decision," Elena interrupted gently, but firmly. "I understand that leadership involves difficult decisions, Dorian. But every day you wait, Someone in that quarter pays the price for your caution. He looked up at her, something raw and uncertain in his expression, a king still learning the true weight of the crown he wore. I don't know how to do this without risking everything, he admitted quietly. The pack's stability, my own authority, possibly even the safety of the very people I'm trying to protect. Then let me help you figure it out, Elena said, surprising herself with the offer, even as she made it. I don't know your world, Dorian. Not really. But I know what's right and what's wrong, and I know that gathering proof, building support, moving carefully, but deliberately, that's not weakness. That's strategy. I'm not asking you to act recklessly. I'm asking you to actually act, instead of hiding behind caution indefinitely. For the first time since she had arrived in this world, Elena saw something shift fully in Dorian's expression. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. A recognition that the bond fate had forced between them might carry more value than either of them had initially been willing to admit. All right, he said finally, quietly. Help me build the case then. Properly. Thoroughly. Enough that even Cade's staunchest supporters among the elders cannot dismiss it as exaggeration or rumor. Elena nodded, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel this soon. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. A fragile sense that perhaps this strange, unwanted bond might actually be capable of producing something good. There's something else, Dorian added, his voice quieter now. Cade will not simply stand aside and allow this. If he senses that his position is genuinely threatened, he will act to protect it, and I fear his response may not be limited to words. I've already gathered that, Elena said, thinking of the cold warning in Cade's parting smile that afternoon. He's already made it clear I've become his enemy. Then we need to move carefully, Dorian said, for your safety as much as for the Runts. Elena appreciated the concern, even as a small, stubborn part of her bristled at the implication that she needed protecting. She had walked into a training yard full of armed guards without hesitation the night before. She wasn't about to start second-guessing herself now. I can take care of myself, she said, but I appreciate the thought. Dorian's mouth curved into something almost like a smile, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him since her arrival. Somehow, I believe you. As the evening light faded fully into darkness outside the tall window, Elena found herself, for the first time since waking in this unfamiliar world, feeling something close to steady ground beneath her feet. She still didn't fully understand the mate bond that tied her to this careful, conflicted king, still didn't know what her life would look like beyond the immediate crisis in front of her. But she knew this much. Whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. And for now, in this strange new world full of danger and cruelty and quiet, unexpected kindness, that was enough to hold on to. The days that followed settled into a careful, deliberate rhythm. Each morning, Elena rose before the palace fully woke and made her way to the Runts quarter, notebook in hand, gathering testimony with the patience of someone who understood that trust, once broken repeatedly, could not be rebuilt in a single conversation. Mira joined her most days, quietly compiling her own records of injuries treated over the years, cross-referencing dates and details until a clear, undeniable pattern began to take shape on the pages between them. Ren became something of a constant presence throughout this process, her initial caution slowly giving way to a quiet determination that matched Elena's own. She had a sharp memory and an even sharper sense of which Runts might be willing to speak if approached the right way, and more than once, her gentle encouragement succeeded where Elena's direct questions alone might have failed. You're good at this, Elena told her one afternoon, as they sat together, reviewing the growing collection of testimonies, getting people to trust you enough to talk. Ren shrugged, though a small, pleased flush colored her cheeks. I've spent my whole life learning how to read people. When you're small and weak in a place like this, you learn to notice things quickly, or you don't survive very long. The observation settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, a reminder of exactly how much these children had already been forced to learn, simply to endure their circumstances. It only deepened her resolve. Callum, too, proved unexpectedly valuable, his careful, guarded nature masking a sharp memory and a willingness to organize the growing body of evidence into something resembling a coherent case. He had clearly given serious thought, over the years, to exactly the kind of argument that might one day be needed to challenge Cade's authority, even if he had never truly believed he would see the day arrive. You should speak to Nora, he suggested one afternoon, nearly a week into their efforts. She's one of Cade's own guards, or she was, until recently. Elena looked up sharply. A guard willing to speak against Cade? She left the guard a few months ago, Callum explained, quietly. No formal announcement, no explanation given. But I've heard she didn't leave on good terms, and I've heard the reason had something to do with what she was ordered to do here. It took 2 more days to locate Nora, who had taken up quiet work tending horses in a distant corner of the palace grounds, apparently content to remain as invisible as possible. She was younger than Elena expected, with sharp eyes that carried a weariness far beyond her years, and when Elena approached her directly, laying out exactly what she was trying to accomplish, Nora's expression shifted through several careful calculations, before finally settling into something like resolve. I was there for some of it, Nora admitted quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. I followed orders I shouldn't have followed, for longer than I'm proud to admit. I left because I couldn't stomach it anymore, not because anyone made me. Would you be willing to testify to what you saw? Elena asked, formally, in front of the pack's elders, if it comes to that. Nora hesitated for a long moment, fear and guilt warring visibly across her expression. Cade would consider that a betrayal he'd never forgive. I understand if you're not ready, Elena said gently, though disappointment settled heavily in her chest. I don't want to put you in danger. No, Nora said, surprising her. I'll do it. I should have spoken up a long time ago. Maybe this is my chance to finally do something right. The addition of Nora's first-hand account transformed the growing case from a collection of Runts testimonies, easily dismissed by skeptical elders as exaggeration or misunderstanding, into something far more difficult to ignore. The sworn word of a former member of the Royal Guard itself, describing specific incidents she had personally witnessed, and, in some cases, been ordered to participate in. Elena brought the expanded evidence to Dorian that evening, watching his expression darken further with each new detail Nora had provided. When she finished, he sat in heavy silence for a long moment, the weight of what he now knew clearly pressing down on him. This is enough, he said finally. More than enough. I cannot in good conscience allow this to continue any longer, regardless of the political risk. What will you do? Elena asked. I'll need to bring this before the full council, Dorian said, formally. With Nora's testimony, the healer's records, everything you've gathered, it cannot be dismissed as rumor once it's laid out clearly in front of every elder in this pack. Elena felt something like relief loosen the tension that had been coiled in her chest for days. When? Soon, Dorian said. But we need to be careful. If Cade learns what we're planning before we're ready to act, he may try to silence the evidence before it can be presented. Nora, especially, will be at risk if he discovers her involvement. 2 days later, as Elena made her way toward the Runts quarter for her now familiar morning visit, she found the courtyard unusually quiet, the atmosphere thick with a tension she recognized immediately as fear. Wren met her at the entrance, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. It's Finn, she said. The guards took him last night. For questioning, they said. About what he's been telling you. Elena's stomach dropped. Where is he now? They brought him back an hour ago, Wren said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. He wouldn't tell me exactly what happened, but he's badly hurt. Mira's with him now. Elena hurried through the quarter to the small building that served as the Runts infirmary, finding Mira bent over a narrow cot where Finn lay, his young face pale and drawn, bruising already visible along one arm. The boy's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and something about the hollow, distant quality of his expression sent a fresh wave of fury coursing through Elena's chest. He'll heal, Mira said quietly, meeting Elena's eyes with grim understanding. Physically, at least. Cade wanted to send a message, and he made sure it was received. Elena knelt beside the cot, gently taking Finn's small hand in her own. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. This is my fault. I should have realized sooner that speaking with all of you would put you at risk. It's not your fault, Finn said, his young voice steadier than Elena expected, carrying a resolve that seemed far too old for someone his age. You're the first person who's ever tried to help us. I'm not sorry I talked to you. Elena felt her throat tighten, unable to fully respond to the quiet bravery in his words. Around her, she could sense the shift in the atmosphere of the entire quarter. Fear, yes, but underneath it, something harder, something closer to resolve. Cade had intended his message to silence them into submission. Instead, it seemed to have solidified something far more dangerous to his authority, a shared, unshakable determination that this could not be allowed to continue any longer. She left Finn's bedside and made her way directly to Dorian's private chambers, not bothering to wait for a formal invitation this time. He looked up from a stack of documents as she entered, his expression shifting to alarm at whatever he saw in her face. "Cade heard a child," she said without preamble, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "To send a message. To try to silence us before we can bring the evidence forward." Dorian rose immediately from his seat. "Is the boy safe now?" "Physically. He'll recover. But this cannot wait any longer, Dorian. Every day we delay, Cade grows bolder, and someone else pays the price." Dorian's expression hardened into something Elena hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful, conflicted caution of their earlier conversations, but a clear, decisive anger that finally matched her own. "You're right," he said. "We move now. Tonight, I'll summon the full council. Whatever political consequences follow, I will not allow this to continue a single day longer." Elena felt a fierce surge of gratitude and relief, tempered by the knowledge that whatever came next would not be easy. Cade would not simply accept defeat quietly. A man who had built his entire authority on cruelty and fear was unlikely to relinquish that power without a fight. But for the first time since she had arrived in this strange, unforgiving world, Elena felt truly certain of one thing: they were finally ready to face him. Word of the summoned council spread through the palace within hours, and by the time evening arrived, a tense, anticipatory silence had settled over every corner of the grounds Elena passed through on her way to the Great Hall. She had never seen the space used for anything beyond the smaller, quieter council meetings she'd attended during her first days in this world, but tonight it had been transformed. Rows of seating arranged to accommodate every elder, every ranking pack member, every soul with enough standing to have a voice in matters that shaped the territory's future. The sheer scale of it settled heavily in her chest as she took her place near the front, Dorian beside her, Mira and Ren, waiting just beyond the threshold with the rest of the witnesses who had agreed to speak. Cade arrived precisely on time, flanked by several of his most loyal guards, his expression carrying the same cold confidence Elena had come to expect from him. If he suspected the true nature of tonight's gathering, he showed no sign of it, taking his customary place among the ranking officers with the easy authority of a man who had never once doubted his own security. Dorian rose to address the gathered assembly, and Elena watched the transformation in him with quiet admiration. The careful uncertainty of their earlier conversations, replaced by a steady, deliberate authority that finally matched the weight of the crown he wore. "I have called this council tonight to address a matter that has gone unexamined for far too long within this pack," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Evidence has come to my attention of sustained, deliberate cruelty carried out against the runts of this territory, under the guise of tradition and discipline." A murmur rippled through the gathered assembly. Elena watched Cade's expression carefully, noting the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, the first crack in his composure since he had entered the hall. "This is a serious accusation," one of the elders said carefully. "One that requires substantial proof before this council can act upon it." "I have that proof," Dorian said, and at his signal, Elena rose to present the carefully organized evidence they had spent the past week compiling. Dates, injuries, patterns of abuse spanning years, corroborated by written records from the pack's own healer. She spoke clearly, steadily, refusing to let the weight of every eye in the hall unsettle her resolve. When she finished, she called forward the witnesses who had agreed to testify. Ren, describing years of quiet mistreatment endured by herself and countless others. Mira, presenting her medical records with the careful precision of someone who had documented far more than she had ever been permitted to speak openly about. And finally, Nora, whose testimony as a former member of the Royal Guard sent a fresh wave of shocked murmurs through the assembled elders. "I followed orders I should never have followed," Nora said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I watched children punished for illness, for exhaustion, for simply being too weak to meet impossible standards. I am not proud of my silence, but I will not remain silent any longer." Throughout the testimony, Cade's composure grew increasingly strained, though he said nothing, apparently calculating his response with the same careful precision he applied to every challenge he faced. When the last witness finished speaking, he finally rose, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension radiating from him. "These are serious accusations," he said, his voice steady, despite everything that had just been presented. "But accusations are not proof of wrongdoing. The training of the guard, the discipline of weaker members of this pack, these are traditions that have protected this territory for generations. I have done nothing beyond what my position requires. You call sustained cruelty against children a requirement of your position?" Elena interjected, unable to hold her tongue any longer. Cade's eyes flicked toward her, cold and assessing. "You are human. You cannot possibly understand what it takes to maintain the strength and discipline necessary to protect a pack like ours." "I understand cruelty when I see it," Elena replied evenly, "and I understand that dressing it up as tradition doesn't make it any less wrong." A tense silence followed her words, the assembled elders exchanging uncertain glances as they weighed the evidence against generations of accepted practice. Elena could see the hesitation in many of their expressions, the discomfort of confronting a tradition they had never fully questioned before tonight. It was an older elder, the same silver-haired man who had spoken in Dorian's defense during that first council meeting, who finally broke the silence. "I have known Cade's family for 3 generations," he said slowly. "I have always believed the discipline of the guard served an important purpose in this pack's survival." He paused, glancing toward the evidence still laid out before the assembly. "But what I have heard tonight troubles me deeply. A child, beaten for illness, years of unreported injury. This is not discipline. This is cruelty, that we have allowed to continue, simply because we did not look closely enough to see it." His words seemed to shift something in the room, the careful hesitation of the other elders giving way, one by one, to a growing recognition of the truth laid bare before them. Elena felt a fierce swell of hope rising in her chest, as she watched decades of unquestioned tradition finally begin to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence. Cade, sensing the tide turning against him, took a step forward, his careful composure finally beginning to fracture. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "You would take the word of Runts, of a disgraced former guard, of a human who has been here barely a week, over generations of established practice?" "I would take the word of truth over comfortable tradition," Dorian said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, silencing the murmurs that had begun to spread. "And what I have seen tonight leaves no room for doubt." Cade's expression twisted into something harder, more desperate. "You would risk the strength of this entire pack over the complaints of the weak?" "I would risk anything," Dorian said, "to ensure that this pack never again mistakes cruelty for strength." For a long moment, the hall held its breath. The confrontation between king and commander stretched taut with tension that seemed ready to break at any moment. Elena watched Cade's hands curl into fists at his sides, watched the calculation behind his eyes as he weighed his remaining options, and felt a fresh wave of apprehension settle over her. Whatever happened next, she understood with sudden clarity. This confrontation was far from finished. The tension in the hall broke like a struck blow. Cade's composure, already fraying under the weight of the evidence laid bare before the assembly, finally shattered completely. "You would side with a human stranger over the wolf who has protected this pack's strength for a decade?" His voice had lost all pretense of calm now, raw fury replacing the careful control he had maintained since entering the hall. "I built the guard into what it is. I trained every soldier who stands ready to defend this territory. And you would strip that from me because a handful of runts and a disgraced deserter dared to speak against me? I would strip it from you," Dorian said, his voice steady despite the charged atmosphere. "Because you built your strength on the suffering of those too weak to defend themselves. That is not leadership, Cade. That is cruelty wearing the mask of duty." Cade's eyes swept across the hall, taking in the shifting expressions of elders who had once stood firmly behind pack tradition, now wavering visibly in the face of undeniable evidence. Elena watched something desperate flicker across his features. The recognition of a man who understood his position was slipping beyond his control. "You would all take their word over mine?" he demanded, turning toward the assembled council. "After everything I have done for this pack?" The silver-haired elder who had spoken earlier rose slowly to his feet, We have seen what your leadership has produced, Cade. Fear, injury, silence maintained through intimidation rather than respect. Whatever you built, it was not the kind of strength this pack should be proud of. Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena feared he might attempt something reckless, some final desperate act to salvage his crumbling authority. His guards shifted uneasily beside him, clearly uncertain where their loyalties should now rest, as the tide of the room turned decisively against their commander. "This is not finished," Cade said finally, echoing the same words he had spoken to Elena in the training yard that first night, though they carried far less weight now, stripped of the confidence that had once made them threatening. "It is finished," Dorian said, his voice carrying absolute authority across the silent hall. "Cade, by the power vested in me as Alpha King of this territory, I strip you of your rank and command within the Royal Guard, effective immediately. You will surrender your position and submit to formal judgment before this council for the harm you have caused." For a long, tense moment, Cade said nothing, his expression cycling through fury, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like grief for the position he was about to lose. Then, slowly, deliberately, he unclasped the insignia of his rank from his uniform and let it fall to the stone floor between them. "You will regret this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a cold promise that sent a chill through the room. "This pack was strong because of wolves like me. You will see, soon enough, exactly how weak it becomes without us." He turned and strode from the hall without waiting for a response, several of his most loyal guards following close behind, though Elena noticed with quiet relief that many others remained, their expressions carrying a mixture of shame and uncertain relief, as though a weight they had carried unwillingly for years had finally been lifted. The hall remained silent for a long moment after Cade's departure, the weight of what had just occurred settling slowly over everyone present. Then, gradually, quiet murmurs began to spread, elders turning to one another, with expressions that carried a complicated mixture of unease and something that might have been the beginning of relief. Dorian turned to Elena, something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before, gratitude perhaps, mixed with a kind of quiet awe. "You did this," he said quietly. "You saw what I had spent years refusing to look at closely, and you refused to let it continue." "We did this," Elena corrected gently. "Ren. Mira. Nora. Every runt brave enough to speak the truth despite the fear of consequences. I only did what anyone should have done from the beginning." "Not everyone would have done what you did," Dorian said. "Most people, faced with a world this unfamiliar, this dangerous, would have chosen silence and self-preservation instead." Elena thought of the golden mark still warm against her wrist, of the strange, unwanted bond that had pulled her into this world barely a week ago, and found, to her own surprise, that she couldn't quite regret any of it, despite everything that had happened. "I couldn't have chosen silence," she said simply. "Not after what I saw that first night." Near the entrance of the hall, Elena caught sight of Ren, watching the proceedings with an expression of cautious, disbelieving hope, the same expression she had worn that very first night in the training yard, though now it carried something new beneath the caution, the first fragile beginnings of real trust. Elena crossed the hall to join her, aware that the true work of rebuilding this fractured system was only just beginning, that stripping Cade of his rank was merely the first step in dismantling generations of cruelty disguised as tradition. But for tonight, at least, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not easily be undone. "Is it really over?" Ren asked quietly, as though afraid to fully believe it. "The worst of it," Elena said, "but there's still a great deal of work ahead of us, making sure this never happens again, making sure the Runts Quarter becomes a place of safety, not fear." Ren nodded slowly, something like determination settling into her young features. "Then I want to help, however I can." "I was hoping you'd say that," Elena said, and found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like days, the weight of the evening's confrontation finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. Behind them, the hall continued to buzz with quiet conversation, the pack beginning the difficult, necessary work of reckoning with a truth they had avoided for far too long. It would not be a simple process, Elena understood. Old habits, old loyalties, old fears did not disappear overnight simply because a single confrontation had exposed them to the light. But it was a beginning, And after everything she had witnessed since arriving in this strange, unforgiving world, Elena had learned that beginnings mattered more than almost anything else. Cade's warning proved to be more than an empty threat. 3 nights after the council hearing, Elena woke to the sound of raised voices echoing through the palace corridors, sharp and urgent in a way that immediately set her heart pounding. She dressed quickly and hurried toward the source of the commotion, finding Dorian already awake, standing in the main courtyard with several of his advisors, their expressions grim in the torchlight. "What's happened?" she asked, joining them. "Cade hasn't left the territory as ordered," Dorian said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "He's gathered a number of guards still loyal to him near the eastern border. Word just reached us that he's been spreading claims among them, insisting that removing him weakens the pack's defenses beyond repair." Elena's stomach twisted with unease. "Is he planning something?" "We believe so," one of the advisors said grimly. "Reports suggest he intends to challenge the council's decision directly, potentially by force, arguing that his removal was carried out unlawfully, given his years of service." "Can he actually do that?" "Pack law is complicated," Dorian admitted. "There are old provisions allowing a commander to challenge decisions he believes threaten the pack's stability. Cade may attempt to use this to justify gathering support against my ruling." Elena felt a fresh wave of frustration mixed with worry. They had believed, perhaps naively, that stripping Cade of his rank would be enough to end the threat he posed. Instead, it seemed they had only delayed a larger confrontation. "What do we do?" she asked. Dorian's expression hardened with resolve. "We prepare. Word must reach every corner of this territory, informing pack members of exactly what evidence led to Cade's removal, ensuring that if he does attempt to rally support, he does so against a pack that fully understands the truth of what he's done, rather than one susceptible to his version of events." Over the following days, Elena threw herself into this new effort alongside Dorian, Mira, and a growing circle of allies who had been moved by the council hearing's revelations. Ren proved invaluable once again, her quiet, steady presence helping to reassure other runts who remained fearful that speaking openly might still bring consequences, despite Cade's formal removal. Nora, too, played a crucial role, using her former standing within the guard to speak directly with soldiers who might otherwise have been swayed by Cade's claims of unjust treatment. Many of them followed his orders out of fear, not genuine loyalty, she explained to Elena one evening. "If they understand there's a safer path forward, one that doesn't require choosing between Cade's cruelty and uncertain punishment, most will choose to remain with the pack rather than follow him into open rebellion." It was difficult, exhausting work, made more urgent by the knowledge that Cade's gathered forces grew slightly larger with each passing day, fueled by his careful manipulation of old fears about weakness and vulnerability. Elena found herself working from early morning until late into the night, meeting with pack members across every level of the territory's hierarchy, listening to concerns, addressing doubts, and steadily building a coalition of support that stretched far beyond the Runts quarter where this entire struggle had begun. Through it all, she found herself growing steadily closer to Dorian, the careful distance of their first uncertain days together giving way to something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. He consulted her regularly now, valued her perspective in ways that had nothing to do with the mate bond that had first brought them together, and Elena found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had come to value his counsel in return. "You've changed since I first arrived," she told him one evening, as they reviewed the latest reports from the eastern border together. "Have I?" Dorian asked, glancing up from the documents spread across the table between them. "You're more decisive now," Elena said. "Less afraid to challenge tradition when tradition proves itself wrong." Dorian was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "I think," he said finally, "that I spent a great deal of my life believing that leadership meant preserving what came before me, regardless of whether it deserved preservation. You've helped me understand that true leadership sometimes requires tearing down what no longer serves the people I'm meant to protect." Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, an emotion she hadn't quite expected to develop this quickly, given the strange, unwilling circumstances that had first brought them together. She still didn't fully understand everything the mate bond meant, still carried uncertainty about her own place in this unfamiliar world, but she understood, with growing clarity, that whatever came next, She wanted to face it standing beside this careful, thoughtful king, who had proven himself willing to change. Their quiet moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. A messenger entered, breathless from having run through the palace corridors, his expression carrying the weight of grave news. "Cade's gathered forces are moving," he reported. "They intend to march on the palace itself before dawn, demanding the council reverse its decision or face open conflict." Dorian rose immediately, his expression shifting into the steady, decisive authority Elena had come to recognize over the past several days. "Gather every loyal guard and advisor," he ordered. "We meet this threat directly, but we do so with restraint. I will not allow this territory to descend into needless conflict if there remains any path toward resolving this peacefully." As the palace erupted into careful, urgent preparation around her, Elena felt a familiar resolve settling over her own uncertainty. Whatever confrontation awaited them at dawn, she understood, with complete clarity, exactly where she needed to stand when it arrived. Beside Dorian, beside the Runts who had trusted her with their truth, and firmly against the cruelty that Cade had spent years disguising as strength. The night stretched on, tense and watchful, as the entire palace prepared for whatever the dawn might bring. Dawn broke gray and cold over the palace grounds, mist clinging low to the earth as Cade's gathered forces came into view along the eastern approach. Elena stood beside Dorian at the palace gates, flanked by the pack's loyal guards, advisors, and a surprising number of ordinary pack members who had chosen, in the tense days leading up to this moment, to stand visibly against the man who had once commanded near-universal fear. Ren stood nearby as well, having refused every attempt to convince her to remain safely within the Runts quarter, her expression set with quiet determination, despite the obvious danger. Cade approached at the head of perhaps 24 guards, far fewer than Elena had feared based on the earlier reports, though still a significant force capable of causing real harm if the confrontation turned violent. His expression, even from a distance, carried none of the cold confidence she remembered from their earlier encounters. Instead, she saw something closer to desperation, the look of a man watching his entire world crumble, and searching frantically for some way to hold it together. "Dorian Ashgrave," Cade called out as his forces came to a halt, a careful distance from the palace gates. "I am here to challenge the council's decision. My removal was carried out based on the testimony of the weak and the disloyal, without proper regard for years of service to this pack." "Your removal was carried out based on undeniable evidence of sustained cruelty against children," Dorian replied, his voice carrying clearly across the mist-covered ground between them. "Evidence you have never once denied, only attempted to justify. Discipline is not cruelty," Cade insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than it once had. "I built the strongest guard this territory has ever known. Would you truly throw that away? Weaken this pack's defenses, based on the complaints of Runts who understand nothing of what it takes to protect a territory?" "I would throw away nothing that made this pack genuinely strong," Dorian said, "but I will not preserve cruelty simply because it wears the uniform of tradition." Elena watched the guards flanking Cade exchange uncertain glances, several of them shifting their weight uneasily, and understood that Nora's efforts over the past several days had achieved exactly what they'd hoped, planted enough doubt among Cade's remaining supporters that his position, even now, remained far weaker than his desperate confidence suggested. "You," Cade said, his gaze finally settling on Elena with cold fury. "This began with you, a human who understands nothing of our world, meddling in matters that were never her concern. It became my concern the moment I watched you threaten a sick child in that training yard," Elena replied, refusing to let his hostility unsettle her resolve. "And it will remain my concern for as long as I remain part of this world." Cade's hands curled into fists, and for a tense, breathless moment, Elena feared he might finally act on the barely restrained violence simmering beneath his desperate composure. But before he could speak or move further, a voice rang out from among his own gathered guards. "Commander." It was one of the younger soldiers, his expression carrying a nervous but resolute determination. "I followed you because I believed you served this pack's true interests. But I've heard the evidence now, same as everyone else. I can't stand behind what you did to those children, no matter how many years I've served under you." The soldier stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between Cade's remaining forces and the palace gates. A clear, unmistakable signal of where his loyalty now rested. A tense silence followed, and then, one by one, several more of Cade's guards began to step forward as well, abandoning their positions behind their former commander. Elena watched Cade's expression crumble as the true extent of his isolation became undeniable, the desperate confidence that had carried him this far, finally giving way to something closer to defeat. He looked around at his rapidly thinning ranks, understanding with visible clarity that whatever confrontation he had hoped to force had already been lost, not through violence, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth finally being heard. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "No," Dorian agreed, his voice carrying something almost like sympathy beneath its steady authority. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way at all. It was supposed to happen years ago, the very first time you raised a hand against someone too weak to defend themselves. I am only sorry it took this long for the truth to finally be heard." Cade said nothing further, his shoulders sagging with the full weight of his defeat. Behind him, the last of his loyal guards made their choice, stepping away to join the growing ranks now standing firmly with Dorian, until Cade stood entirely alone before the palace gates, stripped of every last vestige of the power he had spent a decade building through fear. "Cade Renfrew," Dorian said formally, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority across the silent grounds. "You are hereby banished from this territory, effective immediately. You will gather what few possessions remain yours, and depart before the sun reaches its peak. Should you attempt to return, or should you attempt to cause harm to any member of this pack again, you will face judgment far more severe than banishment." For a long moment, Cade simply stood there, absorbing the full weight of everything he had lost. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away from the palace, alone, into the thinning morning mist, leaving behind everything he had once believed made him strong. The tension that had gripped the entire palace grounds broke slowly, gradually, as pack members began to lower their guard, quiet murmurs of relief spreading through the assembled crowd. Elena felt her own knees weaken slightly, with the release of tension she had been holding since the moment Cade's forces first came into view, and beside her, she felt Dorian's hand find hers, steady and warm despite everything they had just endured. "It's over," he said quietly, disbelief and relief mingling in his voice. "It's over," Elena agreed, though she understood, even in this moment of victory, that the true work of rebuilding what Cade's cruelty had broken was only just beginning. Beside them, Ren let out a shaky breath, and Elena turned to find the young runt watching Cade's retreating figure, with an expression that carried, for the first time since Elena had met her, something close to genuine peace. "He's really gone," Ren said quietly, as though still struggling to fully believe it. "He's really gone," Elena confirmed, reaching out to gently squeeze the girl's shoulder. "And he isn't coming back." Around them, the palace grounds slowly filled with the sounds of a territory beginning, cautiously, to imagine a different future than the one it had known for far too many years. The weeks that followed Cade's banishment brought changes to the palace grounds that Ren still sometimes found difficult to believe, even as she watched them unfold with her own eyes. The Runts Quarter, once a forgotten corner of crumbling stone buildings and quiet suffering, began a slow, deliberate transformation under Elena's careful direction. New guards, chosen specifically for their willingness to treat every pack member with basic decency regardless of rank or strength, replaced the harsh enforcers who had once ruled the training yards through fear. Repairs began on the cracked walls and broken windows that had gone unaddressed for generations, funded directly from the palace's own resources at Dorian's explicit instruction. Nora, whose brave testimony had proven crucial in exposing Cade's cruelty, was formally reinstated to the Royal Guard, this time in a leadership position specifically created to oversee the training and treatment of every pack member, with particular attention paid to ensuring the kind of systemic abuse that had flourished under Cade's command could never again take root unnoticed. "I never imagined I'd end up here," Nora admitted to Ren one afternoon, as they walked together through the newly repaired courtyard. "Overseeing the very training I once helped make so miserable for people like you." "You changed," Ren said simply. "That matters more than where you started." Mira, too, found her role within the pack expanded significantly, formally recognized now as the territory's chief healer. With new resources, and authority to establish proper medical care throughout every corner of the pack's territory, including the Runts quarter that had so long been overlooked. But it was Elena's presence that Ren found herself most grateful for, watching the human woman settle steadily into her unexpected role as the Alpha King's mate, using every ounce of her growing influence to ensure that the changes taking root throughout the territory reached deep enough to truly last, rather than fading away once the initial shock of Cade's exposure had passed. "You didn't have to do any of this," Ren told her one evening, as they sat together near the newly restored well in the Runts courtyard, watching the last light of sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. "You could have simply confronted Cade that first night and then moved on with your own life here. Instead, you've spent weeks making sure everything actually changes." Elena considered the observation for a long moment before answering. "I couldn't have moved on," she said finally. "Not after seeing what I saw. Once you understand that cruelty has been allowed to continue, simply because no one with power bothered to stop it, you can't unknow that. You can't simply walk away and pretend you didn't see it." Ren thought about that, about the strange, unexpected chain of events that had brought a human woman from an entirely different world directly into a training yard, on exactly the night Ren had needed someone, anyone, to finally stand up against the guard's cruelty. It felt, sometimes, like more than simple coincidence, though Ren understood there was no way to truly know whether some larger design had guided Elena's arrival, or whether it had simply been fortunate timing that changed everything. Either way, she found herself deeply, quietly grateful. "What happens now?" Ren asked. "For the Runts quarter, I mean. For all of us." "Now," Elena said, a small, genuine smile spreading across her face, "we make sure this place becomes what it always should have been. Somewhere safe. Somewhere every Runt, every Omega, every pack member who's ever been made to feel less than others can actually thrive instead of simply survive." Over the following months, that vision slowly became reality. The Runts quarter, rebuilt and reimagined under Elena's careful guidance, transformed into a place of genuine opportunity, rather than forgotten neglect. Young Runts who had once been assigned only the most menial, exhausting tasks now found themselves offered proper education, medical care, and, perhaps most importantly, the simple dignity of being treated as valuable members of the pack rather than expendable afterthoughts. Finn, who had suffered so much at Cade's hands during those final desperate days of the old guard's cruelty, grew steadily more confident as the changes took hold, eventually finding genuine purpose helping care for even younger Runts, who arrived in the quarter with nowhere else to turn. Tessa, fully recovered from her illness, discovered an unexpected talent for herbal medicine, training under Mira's careful guidance toward what promised to become a genuinely fulfilling future within the pack's healing house. Ren herself found her place gradually, working alongside Elena on matters of pack governance, her sharp memory and steady understanding of the Runts' unique perspective, proving invaluable as the territory continued reshaping itself into something better than it had ever been before. "You have a gift for this," Elena told her one afternoon, as they reviewed proposed changes to how the pack allocated resources across every level of its hierarchy. "Understanding what people actually need, rather than just what tradition assumes they deserve." "I learned from watching you," Ren said honestly. "You never once let anyone convince you that cruelty deserved respect, simply because it had existed for a long time." Elena smiled, something warm and genuine in her expression. "That's a lesson worth learning, I think. Traditions should have to prove themselves worthy of continuing, not simply persist because no one bothered to question them." As the pack settled into this new, gentler rhythm, Dorian, too, found himself transformed by everything that had unfolded since Elena's unexpected arrival. The careful, uncertain king who had once hesitated to challenge generations of unquestioned tradition had grown into a leader willing to examine every corner of his territory honestly, ensuring that no forgotten quarter, no overlooked group of pack members, would ever again be allowed to suffer in silence simply because those with power chose not to look closely enough. On a quiet evening nearly 6 months after Cade's banishment, Elena found herself standing once again in the same training yard where everything had first begun, though it looked entirely different now, clean, well-maintained, filled with the sounds of young Runts practicing basic skills under the patient, encouraging guidance of instructors chosen specifically for their kindness, rather than their capacity for cruelty. Dorian joined her there, slipping his hand into hers as they watched the scene together, a quiet testament to everything that had changed since that first desperate night. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Being pulled into this world so suddenly, facing everything you've faced since you arrived." Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of everything she had witnessed and endured since that strange, unexpected night. The fear, the cruelty, the long, difficult work of dismantling generations of unquestioned suffering. But she thought, too, of Ren's steady growth into confidence, of Finn's gentle care for younger Runts, of Tessa's unexpected joy in her healing studies, of an entire community transformed from forgotten neglect into genuine belonging. "No," she said finally, meaning it completely. "I don't regret any of it." She looked around at the training yard, once a place of fear and cruelty, now filled with laughter and genuine encouragement, and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle into her chest. "This is what strength actually looks like," she said softly. "Not fear, not cruelty disguised as discipline. This." Beside her, Dorian nodded, watching the same scene with quiet pride. "You taught this entire pack that lesson," he said. "I don't think we'll ever forget it." As the sun set slowly over the palace grounds, casting long, gentle shadows across a training yard finally free of the fear that had haunted it for generations, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in this strange, unexpected world, to simply feel at peace. The Runts were no longer forgotten. The cruelty that had defined their lives for so long had finally, truly ended, and in its place, something better had begun to grow. A community built not on fear and hierarchy, but on the simple, unwavering belief that every single member of the pack, however strong or weak, deserved to be treated with genuine kindness and respect. It had taken courage to challenge what had always been. It had taken patience, careful evidence, and the willingness of ordinary people to finally speak their truth, despite years of learned silence. But most of all, it had taken one woman's refusal to simply look away from cruelty she had never expected to witness, in a world she had never expected to enter. And because of that refusal, an entire pack had finally learned what true strength looked like.